My parents told my brother to take my house since I have no wife or kids, but I fought back and exposed them all in front of the family. I've got a brother who's 29, and he's already got 4 kids. He had his first at 22, the second followed a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was born a couple of months ago. His wife and I do not get along. She always tries to get a rise out of me by acting superior, then turns into an extreme self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliate in any way. She can cry in an instant and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly how she really is and just don't care. She's very good looking, I'll give her that, but she's so awful that I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any sort of job, even though she has a college degree, and my mother willingly helps with the kids all day. Their finances are entirely dependent on my brother. This also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. And privacy is a bit of an issue with all of them under one roof in a 3-bedroom house built in the 60s. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. We're 3 years apart in age, but he developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way. Back then, it was obvious my parents cared for him a lot more. He got the lion's share of everything unless people called them out on it, which happened a fair bit by other family members. This is why my parents packed us all up and moved us about 150 miles away from them. They generally only saw us on holidays. Since it was a 3-hour drive, my brother got physically abusive toward me on several occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit it was rather funny to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had relatives who were very nosy and loved gossiping drama, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on. They threatened to take all my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet when I moved out, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I was low contact ever since leaving home. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on, I would usually only see my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was not kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I really loved. As the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize to an extreme. I really shouldn't have rented a place that was so expensive, but I liked living the high life until that life wasn't kind to me. I realized I should have been living somewhere far cheaper so I could have saved more money to fall back on, but I had a plan. I own a truck simply because I've always loved trucks, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck to live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living out of it far longer than I ever thought. I originally hoped to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still reside. When I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only agreed to let me park my camper there if I paid them basically what it cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park my camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I may as well have been living in an apartment with that rent price they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. They still thought it was absolutely hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined in, pointing at and mocking me while calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night that I had nowhere else to go. I felt scared out of my mind that someone might try to break in. Suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. There was nowhere else I could go, as any other relatives who own houses were fairly far away, and all my friends were apartment people. I was pretty attached to my area, so I didn't want to just leave. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment. It was the only way I could still get my mail. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult. I went looking around to try and find a job similar to my old one. It took months of living the nomadic camper life. In that time, I had to deal with a lot. Everything from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be with an HOA. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses, and when I questioned what HOA, they got incredibly belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway just to avoid the trouble. To have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator, and generators are noisy and require fuel anyway. So, I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail while in college and promised myself never again, though I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I had no stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to still be jobless when it ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind. I had little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep note of where I could park and what local public bathrooms I could use. I kind of envied that the Japanese have public bathhouses. We could really use stuff like that over here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse and old employee parking, spaces that literally no one else seemed to bother using because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. My boss, the company owner, actually liked this arrangement because I was willingly available to take any shift I could get, so long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm not exactly sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us about it the entire time I lived back there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers, there were a few, but the security guards escorted them out. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me, and was working virtually every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office but the janitor and security guard. Beyond that, I usually had to shower at a friend's apartment or at my local gym, as the camper didn't have a shower in it and only had a portable toilet. I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a nasty chore, so I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in to use the bathroom there at any hour. I was even on a first-name basis with the night security guard. He's since become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater. Summers were not fun, though. The camper didn't have AC, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and hands-on learned some new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway into this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I got from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work and, just 2 miles away, found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property. I managed to get it for $10,000 less than the asking price somehow. I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house to take the camper off and set it up in the backyard as its own little building, just in case I want to use it again. When I was fully settled in the house, I was dumb enough to brag about it on my book of faces. My family saw the post, and that's where this really starts. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit, completely unannounced, to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address, so how they found out where I live, I still don't know. None of my friends have fessed up, and no prior family members visited me before that, so I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home or something. It really wouldn't surprise me. Once I opened the door, they practically all shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists, then just started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and my brother's wife, Sil, had this creepy smirk that she was repeatedly flashing me. It was only later that I figured out why, and it made me madder than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were constantly talking about how I've got so much extra space now, and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. My brother kept remarking about how there was more space than our parents' house, and my house was closer to his job too. Red flags all around, I know. Eventually, my brother Dan asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's what finally made me realize they'd planned something. Dan said the house was too much for me alone, and I should let him move in with his family because Sil is pregnant with kid number 4, and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they live in the main house. I'd like to point out that Dan never once spoke of offering rent, mind you. He's got a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, and that I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Dan lost his marbles long ago, thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I'd rent my house or parts of my house to him. Other people maybe, just so I can pay the mortgage off more easily. But certainly not him or his nasty wife. I've heard of this exact kind of situation in videos online many times, and never once did I think I'd actually live it because I thought it's so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and Sil all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic, entitled crazies. So, I picked up my phone and set it to start recording. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I'd done this, and just sat there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then he went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally showed my backbone and said, "Hell no." I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I'd rarely ever raise my voice to him on that level because I was punished by our parents whenever I did, but this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as it wants here. I stood up and told him that my house was not up for grabs, and acting like I'll let him move in just because they want it won't make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me, and said that I didn't deserve the house, and he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back in his face and said that was total nonsense because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids and I don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay me rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in my own house. Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I was going to do this and that I will. I yelled as if their word was law or something and told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then my parents and Sil barged back in through the front door and surrounded me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting, but to sum it up, from this point on, I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," way more times than I can remember in the fight. I told them all they don't have a say in my life or my house and to get out before I called the cops. Sil screamed the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again and I can't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her. She just assumed she could take and take from me like I would just allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up woman who never had any respect for me, so I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back, kicking and screaming. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving. Then my mother said that I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be and to not come back. Then I told Sil that my phone recorded everything, and if she tries anything, I'll press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out, loudly crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said that I better do this for Dan and Sil. I responded by telling her I won't be. After I kicked my parents, brother, and Sil out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went to my social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago when I put my own profile on private. I posted about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home was try to twist the event to make me the villain, and I was exactly right. But I had about an hour to get started before them, and I had video evidence to back up my story about what they'd done. Being preemptive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, Dan and Sil, must have been all set to write their own post, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan and Sil, had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were, so what happened was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular who called me. I don't know who they were, but they ranted at me that I was a horrible brother and I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. This didn't repeat. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch, just like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in again. But I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it, and I even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in her most sickly sweet tone, asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to get lost and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me why I can't just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said, I do not love him as a brother because he treated me like garbage for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. Then I told them to leave, or I'd be calling the police ASAP. They all left surprisingly easily, apart from my mother's loud crying and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family. They were moving stuff in. He just waved to me with a smug grin when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop. But Sil smugly said to me that, like it or not, they were moving in. Then, in the most fake way, while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said that it was okay because my mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I seethed with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug face, so I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, Sil started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, and that I can't do this to her because she and Dan need the house. She cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded, "Dan, it's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard thanks to the window being slightly open. I told Sil if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Dan and Sil, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened, as well as showing them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. Then, when we went to my front door, I saw that they'd changed the lock, and the old lock was lying on the porch with the center of it drilled out. The drill they used was lying right next to it with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown of all the events that happened prior. Well, I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I arrived home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another. So Dan and Sil finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they'd somehow outsmarted me. They'd actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature was not on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have ever actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. I don't think going to jail and court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call CPS for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan and live in the damn camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house to himself instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now, or I'll press charges. I shouted about how they drilled out my front door lock to break in, the lease papers were obvious fakes, they badly forged my signature, and I've recorded video of Sil attacking me. Those are felonies I could ruin their lives with if I wanted, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids, so they had one chance to get out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. Then she went over to Sil and spoke with her quietly for a minute, while my father spoke to Dan. Sil instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits, tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of paper, or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying and the eldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room now. Sil and Dan gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. I swear I think they'd practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Sil kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. All the kids and Sil turned the crying up to 11, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me like when we were kids. He started cursing at me until the cops told him to cool it, or he'd be in cuffs regardless if I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips and looked a mix of afraid and supremely pissed off. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and Sil had all left, and they said they had no intention of going anywhere until this had been resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more drove in for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door. He was really reluctant to hand them over. Then, instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down the street and into a storm drain while saying to go get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to get at them, and he got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just grumbled, then slammed them down into my hand. I then told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, and I voiced that to them. Then, in an overly sarcastic tone, I said something along the lines of, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys where I always get treated like garbage by you all anyway because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. You treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do like you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you and suck it up." My parents were floored after I said all of that, and the quartet of cops were looking pretty judgmental at them as well. I tell you, if you want to put nasty parents like mine on the spot, confront them in front of cops, because they'll likely not try anything really stupid. Then my mother just started crying and walking away. My father just stood there, looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat. Oh, and Sil was off having a tantrum in my front lawn. Soon enough, they all formed a line, handing out boxes, and got their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it all was taken out pretty quickly. But while doing it, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan several times, each time trying to bargain more and more to try to make me change my mind. She said that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house, so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I don't want Dan or his family around. I don't want his money, and I certainly don't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. Sil ended up having another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box down, then sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat looking angry until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. So, before they left, I laid into my parents one last time about all the nonsense they put me through growing up, and with 4 cops being right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it for once. I called them out on so many things that happened and even pointed out how they couldn't just do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. They let Dan and Sil ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could stay in it free of charge, yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to gouge me for more than I could afford, just to park my camper when they knew I was out of a job. There were more extremely judgmental stares from the cops when I said all of that. So, I put my parents on the spot one more time and asked them what I ever did, other than being born, to deserve being treated so badly. When I finally have a bit of success in life, they want to snatch it away from me for their favorite child since they'd rather I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself. I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again because clearly I will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no answers from them. They just stood there looking like fish out of water. So, I continued ranting and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all of that. My father was beet red, but more from embarrassment than anger this time, and my mother was crying that she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed that she is a horrible person. They all are, and I bet they'll go to hell for it too. They were shitty people, and they all knew it. But if I called them out on all this stuff in private instead of in public, they'd just get mad at me and still act like I'm in the wrong. They just kept up the denial for so long that it became a part of who they are. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket to cry, and my father looked more defeated than I've ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me entirely as they finished putting everything back in the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen, not that I'd had a chance to get much furniture yet. They all got back in their vehicles, and Sil just stood staring at me with malice until my brother finally got her to drive the minivan home. As soon as they were all gone, I got back online again and spilled the beans about what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions this time. While the family was somewhat split before this incident, it was now a landslide in my favor. Nearly all of the family has sided with me after this incident, and those who haven't simply aren't siding with anybody. No matter how much my parents previously tried the "we did it for Dan" line, no one listened anymore, so Any remaining familial support they had is now gone. Many in the family who I expected would side with me did, including the former flying monkeys, so I guess they finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at my new house for the next Christmas. My parents were not invited. I wasn't blocked on my brother and Syl's profile, surprisingly, and I saw Syl had her fourth baby in early November. They are still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because Syl kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she could still guilt me. I'm sure it's driving my mother and father up the wall because they aren't getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable Syl, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over their house completely. They might get some peace then. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. For those who kept saying that I should have just gotten my brother and Syl arrested, the only reason I didn't was because they are parents, their kids need them, and if Dan was arrested, he'd likely lose his job. Without that, his family has no money, and Syl has an only months-old baby right now. Neither of them needs to end up in jail, but you don't need jail for revenge. Police can help, yes, but I got payback without filing a police report. Would I be this merciful again? More than likely not, and they know it. I decided to wait on making an account and posting until after the new year, just in case more stuff happened, and it did. As previous readers know, Syl was making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were obviously directed at me, especially after she had her fourth baby in November. She was posting the same repetitive nonsense over and over again. She just found semi-clever ways of rewording it, but she pretty much kept regurgitating that she was tired of living with my parents, that there isn't enough space, she needs her own house, blah blah blah. I know I sound dismissive, but live through what I have with these people, and you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins in front of them too. They're just that bad. Since I waited until January to make an account, more happened, just like I thought. I stated before that I'd invited half the family for a Christmas Eve party at my house, and everyone I invited all came, even though it was a fairly long drive of around 3 to 4 hours for them. But they wanted to come and show me their support. I was praised by them a lot for how hard I'd worked to get a house on my own, and that they were sorry for everything I'd went through. I was asked why I didn't just take my camper and drive the 3 hours back to them, instead of living pretty much homeless for so long. I had to sheepishly admit that I was very attached to living around here, and I had my best employment opportunities in this area. My hometown doesn't have a lot of great job opportunities in my field, if any at all, and I wanted to make my own way as much as I could. They overall accepted my answer. We moved on to having a rather nice party, the best I'd been to in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, and I have to say the one my uncle brought of Ray Charles was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else I've heard. It was a grand and happy time. I felt like for once I could just forget my past issues and enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. About 2 hours into the party, you know who showed up. My parents, brother, and Syl popped in, trying to look all smiles. They didn't even knock, they just walked right in my front door like they were meant to be there. I shut off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and yelled at them before I got another chance to speak. He said they don't deserve to be in my home or my life after the nonsense they tried to pull months earlier, and he was backed up by several other relatives. Mind you, this guy is my mother's brother, and he used to love her to pieces until he found out about the nonsense that went on between me and my parents. My grandparents, as old as they are, hardly got in between us and said to my parents that if they want to make amends with me, it's far too soon, and they've never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. They'd hidden their favoritism for my brother from prying eyes for a long time, but no one was fooled anymore. They needed to make a serious effort to try and actually treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. Then they turned to Dan and Syl and said they've seen the repetitive nonsense Syl keeps posting about. They're tired of it and to just let it go already. My house will not become their new home. Syl went back to her old standard of crying and had a pity party about how she should be the one living here and not me. She plopped down in a chair to have a tantrum and say it wasn't fair I got this house to myself when I have no family of my own, and she has 4 kids that need more space, and she just wanted a better place to live in and feel like a real mom. It was petty of me, but I loudly pointed out that she sucks as a mother because she lets my mother do most of the parenting while she sits on her, but all day drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Dan's money, and she has the nerve to complain about it. I even joked that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get drunk from her breast milk since she drinks so much booze, which I admit went a bit too far as I got some stares. Syl demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom I said the evidence speaks for itself, and if she wanted to be able to afford to move out of my parents' house someday, then she needs to put her college degree to some use, get a job, and learn to save money. My mother already does most of the childcare for my brother's kids anyway, so she'd have plenty of time after her baby gets a little older. My brother's eldest kid, who's 7 years old, ran up to start kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom. He kept at me about how his mom said that I was the bad guy who made her cry and didn't let them live here. That's when my brother grabbed his son to pull him away, but all the other relatives jumped back in, and this sort of turned into a family intervention against Sil and my brother. She was crying, her new baby was crying, her kids were crying. Hell, even Dan was very nearly in tears from the verbal lashing he was being assaulted with. He ended up just sitting on the ottoman I keep shoes by the front door and looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't look anyone in the eye. He couldn't even say 2 words to me, not with a whole house filled with angry people ready to judge him if he tried to let out his inner golden child again. If they weren't there to get in his way, I'd bet this would have ended up a repeat of when he tried to order me around to try and take my house months earlier. By this point, though, he'd been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputation in the family was completely destroyed because the masks were all now off. Soon after, my parents, brother, and Sil all left in defeat. The party resumed, and we all avoided speaking of what just happened for the rest of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night in my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper so there'd be enough space. I admit, it also makes a good guest house. My relatives all wanted a tour of it earlier as well, and they said they couldn't believe I'd been living in it for around 2 years. I got a lot of questions about it, like what summer and winter were like and so on. I was up earlier than everyone else Christmas morning and had a fresh pot of coffee and some ibuprofen for those spiked eggnog hangovers a few of them had. I was complimented on being a way nicer host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After Christmas, Sil finally stopped making posts that were obvious digs at me and deleted all of the old ones as well. But shortly after the new year, she more recently made a new post complaining about how she tried to convince my parents to get a camper, like I did, so it could be set up in the backyard, so Dan and his family could use the whole house as their family home. A taste of one's own medicine is never fun because my parents turned that idea down vehemently. I hear no one is going to push them out of their own home, let alone their master bedroom. The post was only up for a couple of days before Sil removed it, and she has hardly posted anything since then. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, can it still complain? So I guess Sil has realized there's no point in doing it when no one hears her anymore. Dan can't afford to move his family out on his salary alone anytime soon. If they end up expecting another child in the next few years, I won't be surprised. Things mellowed down for me since then, and I've even invited friends over for a poker night. I suck at poker because I can never remember a damn thing about it, but so what? We get to drink beer and eat junk food while being merry idiots. We all loaded up on Whoppers from Burger King and just had the best time grown men can when they just want to have good, unadulterated fun and get piss drunk. I think maybe around summer, I'll look into possibly dating someone. I'm not exactly getting younger here. Fingers crossed that goes well. My camper just sits idle in my yard now, and I admit, there were some days I went out there just to spend time in it. I did live in it for 2 years. It's like my second home. Maybe one day I'll actually get to use it for camping like it was meant to be. I've never been camping. My parents considered it a waste of time, so it'd be a completely new experience for me.